All right, so today for chapter 7.2, you should already have these notes, okay? These were printed out and given to you guys before we even started, so make sure you have these out. You also will want to have out a piece of patty paper. If you don't have any, you know where it is up in front on top of the file cabinet. So we're going to be talking about something called congruence today. So a couple of kind of things that we need to, make sure that you know. The first one is this symbol. Okay, the symbol is like an equal sign. If you can't see it, it's an equal sign with kind of a squiggly line on top. Okay, that means what? Does anyone know what that means? That means congruent. Okay, so that symbol means that two things are congruent. Okay, what symbols are used to indicate congruent angles? Okay, congruent angles are indicated by things called arcs. Okay, and they look, if you look down here, they look like this. Okay, like little angle kind of deals. And then what symbols are used to indicate congruent segments? Congruent segments are indicated, by something called tick marks. Okay, these are called tick marks, and they're just basically lines. Okay, and I'll show you which ones you use when. And we say, how do we know based on the markings that the triangles are congruent? Okay, the way you know that is that all three sides, if all three sides lengths are congruent. Okay, if all three side lengths are congruent, therefore the triangles must be congruent. Okay, so if all three side lengths are congruent, oh, I'm sorry, I really can't see that, my bad. If all three side lengths are congruent, therefore the whole triangle has to be congruent. Okay, so for a triangle, you would have to have three side lengths that are the same. For something that has four sides, you'd obviously have to have all four sides be the same, okay, or be congruent to one another. So that's how we know based on those markings, so based on the arcs and the tick marks. So for example 1, it's asking you write congruent statements comparing corresponding parts in the congruent triangles below. Okay, so we want to figure out which parts are congruent or similar, same shape, same size to each other. So we know that the ones with the rectangles are both 90 degrees. So you could write angle R is congruent. You can't say equal, but is congruent. Angle R is congruent to angle D. Okay, now let's look at some other ones. First, we're going to look at the angles, then we'll look at the sides. Okay, the next one, the one that has one arc symbol in it, is angle P. That would be congruent to this one that has one angle mark in it, and that is angle C. And then the last angle that has to be congruent are these two up here. They have two arc marks. Okay, you can't just write one because then we wouldn't know which one was congruent to what. So the one that has two is angle P is congruent to angle B. Okay, so that's how we write congruent statements. Now those are just about the angles, Now we want to write things about the sides. Okay, so we're going to name some sides. The first one is the one that has one tick mark. Okay, so the ones that have one tick mark are congruent to each other. You want to name these. We usually name them in alphabetical order. So you could say RQ or QR. We like to name them in alphabetical order. And the way that you write a side is we put a line over it. So side QR is congruent to side BD. Just put the line over it. That means a line segment. Then we can move on to the one that has two tick marks. And two tick marks, and these are always going to be given to you. So two tick marks, PR, we're going to write them in alphabetical order, and you can write the line first or last, it doesn't really matter, is congruent to the other one that has two would be CD. Okay. And then the last one that you'd want to write is the one that's the longest one. Okay, so we would say angle PQ is congruent to angle, so PQ is congruent to angle CB. Okay? That's how we write congruent statements. So that's it. Okay, you're just writing which parts are congruent to one another. Okay, let's look at the next one. So it says, write congruent statements comparing the corresponding parts in the congruent figures shown below. Okay, so this one, we want to figure out which ones are similar to each other. So this time, let's start with the sides. Okay, so first we can start with the sides that have one tick mark. Okay, so side MP, is congruent. So MP is congruent to AS. Okay, and you're always, make sure that you're going, especially in, these are called quadrilaterals, okay, or in polygons, so something with 4 on the sides, make sure you're going in the right direction. So like the angle towards the right angle, okay, the little angle towards the right angle. Then the next one, if we go to the side that has 2 tick marks, okay, PO is congruent to SK. Then if we go to the side that has 3 tick marks, okay, I'm going to go from the bottom to the top. So angle ON, or excuse me, side ON is congruent to side KB. And then the last one is the side with 4 tick marks. Okay, so I'm going to go from the double angle to the single angle. So double angle, double arc to single arc. So that would be NM is congruent to BA. And these ones I didn't write in alphabetical order, but that's okay. It's the same thing either way. Now let's look at the angles that are congruent to each other. Okay, so if we look at the angles that are congruent to each other, first we could start with the little ones, the one that have 1 arc. So we could say angle M is congruent to the other one that has just 1 little arc. That's angle A. So that's one of them. Then the one that has 2 would be angle N is congruent to angle B. So that's the one with 2 tick marks. Then we're going to look at the ones on the inside, okay, the one that are in between the double arc and the right angle. Okay, so like you couldn't say that P and K are congruent. Okay, those don't work because they're not in between the same 2 things. Okay, so you want to follow, I'm going to look at the right angle at the end of the 3 tick mark side. So we could say angle O is congruent to angle K. And then finally the ones on the outside, angle P is congruent to angle S. And that's how we do those. Okay, now let's go ahead and look on the back. So the back of your worksheet, again, we're going to be talking about corresponding parts and congruent triangles. So it says triangle RST is congruent to triangle NML. Write congruent statements comparing the corresponding parts. Then determine which transformation maps. So how do we get from here to there? Okay, so first let's figure out which parts are equal, okay, or congruent. So for this one, you first want to figure out which angles are congruent, okay, or which sides. So let's look at this. We know that this side is 2 lengths. So I'm going to label that as 2. This one is also 2 lengths. The other ones I can't quite measure, okay, I can't quite count because they're not exactly on lines that I can count. But I can start with knowing that at least these 2 are definitely congruent to each other. Okay, so we could start with figuring out that MN, side MN, is congruent, MN, and it is congruent to angle, excuse me, MN is congruent to angle SR. Okay? Then the next ones are a little bit tricky. Okay, so what you might want to do here is you might want to figure out, remember, we're going from this one to this one. Okay, so I'm going to draw this real quick. Okay, just draw this. Doesn't have to be like absolutely perfect, and then label it. So that was R, T, and S. So use your patty paper. Now let's figure out how I get from here to here, because it might help me to figure out which parts are congruent. Okay, so to get there, how would you get there? Looks like I would definitely have to do a reflection, and this is over the x-axis, so reflect over x-axis. Okay, so if I reflect over the x-axis, we could go up here. Okay, that would go straight up. Then at least my triangle is now like in the right direction, kind of. Okay. Then I could translate, because it looks like I'm almost exactly in the same spot. Okay. So how far would you have to translate? Let's just figure out how far would I have to go, excuse me, to get from this edge to this edge. You would have to count over 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 spaces. Okay. So reflect over the x-axis, then translate. Translate is just a slide. 6 units to the left. Okay? So we actually took care of the second part. Okay? And while we did that, we realized that these ones are going to be congruent. So it's kind of upside down. Okay? We already knew that S was congruent, or excuse me, SR was congruent to MN. But now we also know that this side one, and if you kind of flip it over, you can remember that that was RT. Side RT is congruent to this side one, so that's side LN. Okay, so side RT is congruent to NL. And then the last one, the only one that's left behind, is side TS. So side, I lost my place, sorry. Side ST, okay, side ST, if I flipped this over and moved it over, side S to get to T is congruent to M to L. M to L. Then we can also figure out which angles are congruent. Okay, so this is kind of a lot of work, I know. But you can also figure out which angles are congruent. Once you got to here, you can just kind of match them up. So R is congruent to N. So angle R congruent to angle N. And you just have to match them up. Angle S is with M. So angle S is congruent to angle M, as in Mary. And then the last one, angle T, is congruent to angle L. Okay, so you have to have all of those done and tell me how it gets from this one to this one, and make sure you're reading it really carefully so you know which one is going where. Okay, same thing on number 4. It says parallelogram WXYZ, so that's this one, is congruent to this parallelogram. Write congruent statements comparing the corresponding parts, then determine which transformations map parallelogram here to here. Okay, so first thing we want to do is I'm actually going to do the transformation part first. Okay, so let's look at the transformation part, and we want to get from here to here. So I'm going to draw this just in case we have to do any rotations. Okay, make your T, and then draw this on your patty paper. So X, Y, Z, and W. So to get there, we're definitely going to have to go, well, actually, could I do a rotation? Let's see if I could do a rotation. Okay, let's figure this out. So if you put your pencil like right in the middle, could I rotate 1, 2 parts? Doesn't match up, so I can't rotate. And let's go back to here. Could I reflect Okay, could I reflect across the x-axis? So could I flip it across the x-axis? Is it going to be lined up? Looks like it will. Okay, so it looks like I go across the x-axis and then move over how many spots? To get this bottom left corner, you would have to move over, from here you'd move over 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So reflect over the x-axis and then translate 5 units left. Okay, reflect over the x-axis and translate 5 units left. Then let's figure out which sides and angles are congruent. So I'm going to take this, we've reflected over here, and these are kind of upside down, but you'll just have to kind of read them backwards, okay? So here we know that angle L is congruent to X. So angle L congruent to angle X. The bottom one here is angle W is congruent to angle K. Then, so we're just matching these up. M is congruent to, that was Y upside down, so angle M congruent to angle Y. And then the last one, angle N, is congruent to, this was angle Z. And it's upside down, so if you need to flip them over to read them, that's totally fine. Then we're going to do the same thing for the sides. Okay, so let's start with this bottom side. Okay, LK, side LK, congruent to XW. Side on the left, side LM is congruent to XY. Across the top, MN, side MN is congruent to, across the top, that's YZ. And then the last one on the left, or the right hand side, KN is congruent, KN is congruent to WZ. So this is where that patty paper is really going to help you, hopefully. Okay, now we're going to move on to congruent measurements. Okay, so congruent measurements. So in number 5, it says, in the figure below, this quadrilateral is congruent to this one. What is the measure of angle X? So we want to figure out which sides are congruent to each other and just fill in all the blanks. So it basically looks like on this one, they took this picture, and you can draw it on your patty paper, D, C, B, and A, and they just flipped it over, okay? When they flipped it over, it went right here. So hopefully you can see that they just reflected this, okay? So if they reflected it, that means the outside here will be 70 degrees. Then in between the 2 points, between the 70 and the 145, we can put in a 145 there. Between the 70 and the 145 is 3 meters. And above, from 145 all the way up to the top, is 4 meters. So fill in as much as you know, then look at your question. What's the measure of angle X? It's already written there. Measure of angle X is equal to 145 degrees. Okay, you can write the measure of angle X is equal to 145 degrees. That's it. Okay, then last one for number 6. If you're using a brace to support a tabletop, okay, so these are braces to support a tabletop. In the figure BCE, so angle B, or triangle, excuse me, and I'm going to draw this like this. So BCE, this triangle, is congruent to DFG. Okay, if the measure of angle CEB, so if you draw this, go in the middle, CEB is 50. So right inside there is 50. What is the measure of FGD? Okay, so if you start here, B, then go to C, then go to E. Okay, so B to C to E. If you look at just the first two, B and C are going to be congruent to D and F. So let's put some tick marks. So BC is congruent to DF. So these sides are congruent to each other. Then the two in the second part, CE is congruent to FG. So put two tick marks, FG. Then obviously the last one, since they're congruent triangles, these will be congruent as well. So now you just have to figure out, where does the 50 go? The 50 is in between the sides of the tick marks of 2 and 3. So in between the tick marks of 2 and 3, 50 degrees. And then check to see, did we answer our question? What's the measure of FGD? So FGD is 50 degrees. Just like that. And then the last part, in the figure, the length of CE is 2 feet. Okay, so we told you that was 2 feet. What's the length of FG? And since we already put our tick marks here, we know that this one has 2 and this one has 2, so they are congruent. So this is also 2 feet. Okay, homework for this, you guys are going to be working on page 525. Okay, so make sure you write this down. You're going to be working on page 525. And you're doing numbers 1 through 6 and 12 through 16. Okay, page 525, numbers 1 through 6 and 12 through 16.